Okay. Welcome to the first of 3 webinars on demand as root cause for human trafficking. Today, we shall discuss sex trafficking and prostitution. On behalf of the Order Malta, I would like to thank Sister Mirjam Beike for her active participation in the organization of these webinars, as well as Brian Iselin. Brian is at the origin of the emphasis we shall now put on the demand side of human trafficking. He is the co-organizer of these 3 webinars. As we have seen in our previous webinars, criminal prosecution is needed but not sufficient. To date, few government legislations and measures have addressed demand. Understanding and addressing demand is the way forward to prevent and combat human trafficking. This is why we welcome the Nordic or Swedish model of prostitution that will be discussed during this seminar. Human trafficking is a heavy, complex phenomenon that requires broad cooperation between governments and civil society, including religious organizations. We all need to address the root cause, the main root cause, which is a culture of striving for maximum profit on the part of producers and consumers, a culture that undermines and even denies the dignity of the human being, the family, work, and the environment. In today's throwaway culture, women, men, children are seen as commodity that can be freely exploited, disposed of, an object for sale. Today, we are very fortunate to welcome distinguished speakers. First, Sister Mirjam Beike, Geneva representative at the UN in Geneva of the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd. She worked 30 years with survivors of trafficking in Germany and Albania. She is a working board member of RENATE, Religious in Europe Networking Against Trafficking and Exploitation, and of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. Second speaker is Brian Iselin, former Australian soldier and federal agent, founder of the NGO Slave Free Trade, working on eliminate modern slavery on the workplace. This is Sandra Norak, survivor of Loverboy method, now works to raise awareness about the harms of prostitution. She is active in a German association called Sisters that helps women in prostitution and assists them in leaving prostitution. Mrs. Inge Bell, German human rights activist, entrepreneur and second chairperson of the women's rights organization Terre des Femmes and the Bavarian branch of the aid organization Solvodi, which means solidarity with women in distress. We are very grateful that Sister Lea Ackerman, founder of Solvodi, might join us later during the discussion. And now I have the great pleasure to give the floor to our first speaker and moderator, Sister Mirjam Beike. Mirjam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Michel. You have already presented our speakers. So now I see that the first speaker that we planned has disappeared, but he will come back. It will be technical problems. Hi, Brian. So Brian was already introduced by you, and we want first to go deeper and give an introduction on the role of demand, because to understand this is very important for us. So please, Brian, you have the floor.
Great. Thanks so much, Sister Mirjam. Thanks so much for the invitation again, Michel, to be here. And I'm guessing at this point, some participants are going, oh no, not this guy again. Yes, sorry. I will try to be quick. And I'll also, thanks, Michel, for the tip, be slower than usual. I've been working on trafficking for nearly 2 decades. And before that, I was working in global counter-narcotics. The majority of the time working on trafficking, I've been working on sexual exploitation. And throughout those 20 years, every day, there's not a single day I haven't been disappointed with the evidence of a global scarcity of something that is really actually quite shocking for us to be failing at. Globally, we are failing to have any impact at all against human trafficking. And at the same time, we see a mounting body of evidence of a continuing upward spiral in trafficking in the vast majority of countries of the world. And I think one of the leading contributors to this lack of impact is actually a pretty lousy recognition of the causes of trafficking. It's so essential to be crystal clear on cause. And I've been beating this drum for almost 20 years, and it's still a problem. And I think, frankly, people are just intellectually quite lazy about it. If interventions are incorrectly addressing false causes, that 100% leads to lack of impact. Addressing false causes means a lack of impact should actually be the only expected outcome. Addressing, for example, a vulnerability, it would be quite mad to hope that that will deliver impact if, by impact, you actually mean curing something. If you treat headaches arising from a tumor in the brain, it would be quite remarkable if you actually ended up curing that tumor. You would have made medical history. And the same is so for human trafficking. One of the big reasons for this mistake as to cause is the common but completely false understanding that trafficking is linear. This is the very definition of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. I think you all know it. It follows, therefore it was caused by. Although it's very widely taught this way, trafficking is not linear, it is circular. A poor woman being recruited and moved from a rural location in Mexico to a brothel in Texas does not make the conditions of the victim at that time in that place the cause. Being poor is not the cause, being female is not the cause, being Mexican is not the cause. So let's just be very clear. I'm going to really hammer this home if I can. Let's be super clear about causation. In identifying cause, we should be looking not for these inconsequential forces that launch boats into the stream, but rather seek the source of the stream itself. It's pretty simple to be clearer on cause. Find out what makes it all happen, and you have the cause. Once you find the cause, it's recognizable by being a rule with few, if any, exceptions. So, because most people are poor before being trafficked, does not make poverty the cause. The vast majority of people in poverty are never trafficked. The same fallacy applies to other vulnerability factors. In migration contexts, they are often correctly called push factors. Domestic violence, being in prostitution, illiteracy, lack of citizenship, being a woman, ethnicity, age. These all are contributory conditions that may exist in a supply country, but that doesn't make them a cause. I mean, if we applied that logic on almost any other subject, if you think about it very clearly, we would see the cause of murder as the gun, not the shooter. Or we would see the cause of rape being a woman or wearing a short skirt. It's patently ridiculous. Of course it is. But who thinks about this when we talk about human trafficking? There is identifiable cause in trafficking. It's not hard, but you have to apply systems thinking, not linear thinking. Because if you think about the criminal process, it's linear. Criminal processes are. That's why the criminal law is written like that. If you elevate your view above mere process, in fact, you can't help but see it. Consider conceptually for a second the forces at work. Move backwards behind the specifics of individual cases, and then back further behind sets of cases and classes of cases, and look more towards the sources of all cases. And the single force that every case of trafficking comes back to at some point is demand. It precedes the movement of a person. It precedes the recruitment of a person. It always precedes their trafficking. A demand always pre-exists. And that demand is quite simply the driver. And addressing that driver is the only way to have any impact whatsoever. Sorry? No, you don't want me to stop. Okay. So it was always thus, right? Addressing the driver is the only way to have any impact. If we're talking exclusively about trafficking for the sexual exploitation of women, the trafficking of any particular woman from any location on any given day is driven by a demand for paid sexual services by someone with those characteristics. The reason it does not happen to everyone is that there needs to be a convergence. So this is where experience as a federal agent comes in. We look at convergences of circumstances. But a convergence of the pre-existing demand for that woman with criminal opportunity, that is, the recruiter has access, with location, a transporter is active there, and with a joined up network that can bring that person from point A to point Omega, and Omega is the point of exploitation, is what makes one person a trafficking victim and an almost identical person not a trafficking victim. A network driven by, motivated by, directed by, rewarded by someone's demand for that victim at that place at that time. It's really very specific. So the purpose of my intervention is to, I think Michel would like me to make this the point of my intervention, is to point out that the cause of trafficking for sexual exploitation is to satisfy demand for paid sexual services. That's it. It's not more complicated than that. Illicit markets are just like licit markets, and they're driven by demand, not supply. It's something we learned in the world of counter-narcotics very early on. We didn't change the way we did things because there was so much invested in supply-side initiatives on narcotics. But at the same time, we recognized that demand was where we needed to do things to be effective, because supply, quite seriously, with drugs as with people, is infinite. If we acknowledge trafficking is a response to a demand, that completely changes our understanding about what we need to do. Have a think about all of the measures you find that you know about, you read about, they're in the Thomson Reuters Foundation's always writing about them, about human trafficking, and consider for a moment how many of them address demand and how many of them do everything else. Globally, billions of dollars are spent every year on supply-side measures and the treatment of vulnerabilities. There's an entire global... There's an entire global movement, an entire business, an entire industry built on using human trafficking money to address vulnerabilities such as poverty, illiteracy, etc. And, you know, addressing poverty and illiteracy is very important, but it's not a human trafficking initiative. It doesn't make a dent in human trafficking and never will. None of them have a chance of impact because you're not addressing cause. If you have no hope of changing the nature, the structure of the system, treating the headache is important. But don't ever kid yourself that by doing that, you're curing cancer. Most trafficking measures are focused on reducing these vulnerabilities and limiting these factors in supply countries, whereas the causal demand side remains almost completely neglected. So if we just invert our view for a second, if we just decide that it is cause that demand that causes illicit markets, this means we have to have a very good think about everything that we're currently doing, and especially everything that is currently being funded by these massive funding agencies that deal with human trafficking and modern slavery around the world. All human trafficking is a market response to a demand for people to perform certain acts as services. So now I became a bit of a scholar of behavioral economics. So I adopt the pure economic definition that effective demand is a willingness to buy coupled with a capacity to buy. And so this is where we see the popular categorization of the 3 Ds. You probably all heard this: dirty, dangerous, and degrading. It comes into play. Where there exists a demand for someone to do dirty or dangerous or degrading or all three, that's where traffickers who sense profit and act to supply the services as a result. It's the demand perceptions of the traffickers that are at the heart of demand for trafficked victims. A critical point to be made is the sheer waste of time in differentiating between the man who buys sex from a trafficked woman and the man who buys sex from any woman. Because one very simple and tragic fact is that those men who buy sex do not care about the identity or the situation of the woman at hand. Their demand is faceless, nameless, and consentless. So, to understand the buyer side as the start of this demand equation and thinking about where we could act, behavioral economics can be actually really helpful. Sexual services are higher order wants. Factors that influence and change demand for higher order wants can shift the demand curve. And they include changes in tastes and preferences, including, for example, racism, convenience and availability, which includes, of course, things like risk of detection and cost of detection, changes in real or disposable income, changes in population, like gender equality, for example, This is why Sweden is such a hub for things like the Nordic model, because of the high levels of gender equality. Changes in the price of substitutes or other goods, expectations about the future, and change in distribution of income in society. So one very important thing, and I think I'm running out of time maybe, but now a really important feature of all higher order wants is that they are generally considered insatiable, because the higher the general level, that is the aggregate demand in society, the higher still the demand becomes. With higher order wants, there is an upward spiral of demand. It becomes self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing. And that same demand spiral also works downwards. You will all have known of higher order wants that didn't become interesting for people, and demand started to plummet, or something serious happened, a scandal, for example, and demand spiraled downwards. And so this is the beauty of a thing called external economies of scale. The risk of any one transaction in an illicit market falls with an increase in the total number of transactions, and vice versa. The risk of any one transaction increases with a decrease in the total number of transactions. Do you understand the inverse relationship there? The risk of a transaction falls when the total number of transactions increases. So an increase in the volumes of transactions reduces the cost of services, reduces the industry-wide risk of arrest, and cyclically leads to more transactions. And the obverse is true. So these external economies of scale are really important for us because they're self-perpetuating, both upwards and downwards in their impact on demand, which means something very, very important for us. If you punch an upward demand spiral in the guts, you can change its nature and its direction. And this self-perpetuating tendency is important for public policy on trafficking, as you can imagine. A decent measure of demand reduction to arrest an upward trend of demand can trigger a spiral downwards. Human trafficking policy, if you really intend to have impact on the problem, not just issuing paracetamol for a tumor, you should aim at the decision-making of buyers and traffickers, shrinking the illicit market, while simultaneously reducing the harms associated with both the existence and the shrinking of the market, because there will be people hurt by the shrinking of the market. To use business language, what we want to do, the aim is to safely reduce the total number of illicit transactions in an economy, in a country. This means we also protect the vulnerable, for whom shrinking markets mean livelihood challenges, obviously, by employing viable exit strategies for women in prostitution. I think I've gone on long enough. Let me just skip to the end. While buyers and traffickers can act relatively free of consequence, their likelihood of engaging in the market increases. The number of transactions increases. Demand increases. It becomes easier, cheaper, and far more likely in a consequence-free environment for a man to buy sexual services or for a trafficker to sell it. And it increases dramatically the number of transactions, which is a self-perpetuating upward spiral, right? More transactions leads to many more transactions. So increasing transactions is what we actually see in countries, in markets where regulation and decriminalization approaches to prostitution apply. They inadvertently become magnet economies. The overflow of demand, that is the limit at which the local population will provide sufficient women to satisfy this increasing male demand, it must be met from abroad. That's where trafficking steps up. We don't have time to address all of the policy measures that we could take. The evidence is crystal clear across the Nordic region. And I noticed a very good report just in the last couple of days from Norway, which came out in favor of this as well, that increased perceived risk when buying results in reduced transactions. Reduced transactions makes the market less attractive to traffickers, and trafficking drops off. From a behavioral perspective, the only solution for impacting the dimensions of the trafficking of women for sexual exploitation is to reduce the number of buyers buying. It's that simple. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Very impressive. So I want to say this will be a video on demand, and I will surely go back and listen to this again and take everything in. I like that you said like treating the headache is one thing, but you have, of course, you have to treat the symptoms. Or demand is faceless, nameless, and consentless with the demand for sexual exploitation, and it's very.
You have to treat the tumor if you want to cure the tumor.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this introduction for our discussion. Now I want to welcome Sister Lea Ackerman. Thank you very much that you are there, Lea. We are going on in the row. So at the moment we don't hear you, but don't worry, our technician will give you the word. We will continue with Sandra and then with...
I would like to greet you all, and I'm very happy to see you and to hear your argument.
Thank you. So we didn't. So I will just give a short introduction of whom we have here. Sister Dr. Lea Ackerman studied pedagogy, psychology, and theology. Worked as a religious sister of Our Lady of Africa for 5 years in school service in Rwanda. Then 7 years as an educational advisor at Mission Munich, and lecturer at the Catholic University of Eichstätt. In 1985, you went to Mombasa, Kenya, and got involved with women who became in prostitution through impoverishment and sex tourism. And this gave rise to the idea of founding Solvodi, a registered association that works on a donation basis. And solidarity with women in distress is now in Germany, it's in Austria, it's in Kenya. So you are spreading this network around the world. You got the Federal Cross of Merit. You are Women of Europe, and you have a honorary doctorate from the University of Lucerne. You got the Romano Guardini Prize and the Anton Meritini Memorial Prize. So thank you very much for being with us. Now all our listeners know who is here amongst us, but I beg you a little bit for patience because our next speaker is Sandra. So now we have heard about root causes, and Sandra, she knows best of us all what it means to be trafficked and to suffer sexual exploitation. So please, Sandra, we are very honored to hear your story and what you, as a survivor, has to tell us. So you have, yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me now? I don't know how to put the micro on. Okay, thank you for organizing this and for talking about prostitution and trafficking and solutions. I want to speak about first a little bit about me, about the lover boy method, which part legislation plays, and also about the mechanisms of trafficking, prostitution, and about demand. So first, a few facts about my story I have been through. I became acquainted with my trafficker and pimp, who was about 35 years old, on the internet when I was a minor. At the time, I had long continuing problems with my mentally ill mother, a stay in the clinic due to anorexia as well as self-harm behavior. And of course, he knew the circumstances and used my vulnerabilities. So when I came home from school, I stationed myself immediately at the computer and spent a long time in different chat rooms. And we wrote more and more than every day. And he waited for me online and gave me the feeling to be there for me. I spoke with him more and more about my problems, and he showed support and understanding. So it came to the first real meeting where he invited me to eat. He was my first love, the first person that I had sexual intercourse with. And up to this point, prostitution was not mentioned. Talking about prostitution began slowly, where he knew that I emotionally hang on him, and he was the only person to whom I related. So at the weekend, I traveled by train to his city, And after a while, he took me to brothels of some of his friends who were brothel owners. And after a while, he wanted that I prostitute myself. And when I refused, he began to explain he had great debts and was stuck into difficulties, and I'm the only person who can help him. So I had anxiety of losing him and that something is happening to him. And so I began to prostitute myself. I became a full-time prostituted woman, and broke off school because I could not lead this double life. So this strategy, which is about targeted searching, recruiting, and pushing young women into prostitution for the purpose to exploit them sexually by faking or simulating a love relationship at the beginning, falls under human trafficking and is called the lover boy method. This form of recruiting for human trafficking is getting more and more common because it is the safest way for the trafficker to escape prosecution. He can hide behind the alleged voluntariness of the young women that are under his control. So lover boy traffickers and lover boy pimps, they look for an easy prey. They use the vulnerabilities of the young women, especially when you come from a broken home, when you have already experienced sexual abuse, violence, neglect in the past. These are the general preconditions for entry into prostitution. But it's not limited that only vulnerable young girls are trafficked. In Germany, there are also women who have been victims of lover boy pimps who come from families where there's no evidence of abuse or violence. But they met their lover boy pimp when they were very young. It was their first time being in love. They were like typical adolescents rebelling against their parents. So we have a very this method is very common when it comes to trafficking and pimping. So, but how someone is able to endure prostitution, what means enduring very intimate things, being in prostitution and enduring countless penetrations by strangers, one needs attitudes that trivialize this violence, that it all was bearable and or not so bad at all. And how do you get such an attitude? If someone is abused physically or psychologically early in the childhood, as it was with me, the affected person is convinced by the idea that being mistreated is not so hard or deserved or normal, because you don't know how it is to be treated well. In psychological traumatology, this is called the offender-influenced way of thinking. It is kind of survival strategy to stand violence better. So if the current situation cannot be endured or changed, affected persons often take the perpetrator's point of view, because if they act like offenders want them to act, the chances of survival are higher. So, for example, if I do exactly what they tell me, they will probably let me alone and it will not become so bad. Or words like, you are worthless can turn into I am worthless, or you will never achieve it can turn into I will never achieve it. So this internalization and taking over of the offender's ideas due to self-protection becomes manifest until one is grown up, and it determines daily life, not only in the form of a negative self-image, but also in the form of a lack of self-protection and self-care. So someone who had to learn enduring violence early as a survival strategy often won't later be able to protect against it. And for these persons, there's a very high risk of being trafficked and exploited. So, and when in addition, sexualized violence in the form of prostitution is not named as such in society, and in a state like in Germany, trivialized as a service, those offender-influenced ways of thinking will not be terminated but confirmed. So with the legality of buying sex, people, or mostly women in prostitution, are taught that the violence that they experience in prostitution would not be real violence because it is legal, that they can be sold for sexual objectification and abuse. So the government signalizes with its liberal legislation, prostitution is not violence, but a normal job. And this point of view is taken over by many counseling organizations too, and that is dangerous because it misleads a person to get into prostitution without clarifying to them the immense amount of violence that awaits them there. So I give you an example what I mean. When my trafficker pushed me for the first time into a brothel during my recruitment as a young adult, I had a very bad intuition and wanted to escape. I was young, unstable, vulnerable, and didn't know how to hold myself, and in which kind of dangerous situation I was. He led me towards prostitution and coerced me and said I should not be embarrassed. It was all normal, he told me. It's normal in Germany, it's just a job, and so on. And so I remembered the point of view of our government, which considers prostitution as a job, and that pimps as well as brothel owners appear on talk shows being called businessmen instead of criminals. So I remembered that this milieu was mainly described as not so bad at all. And exactly this image of normality in the prostitution milieu is transmitted with Germany's state legislation. And so I could not recognize that I was on the way sliding into the middle of a criminal milieu full of violence. It was not named as a crime and won't be named as one. So, however, our state has got a responsibility to be a role model. Every state has that responsibility to be a role model and provider of orientation, especially for young and vulnerable people. If our state had told me that, for example, with a prohibition of buying sex or by talking about the violence in prostitution, that prostitution is violence and a violation of human dignity, my trafficker would have had it much harder to lead me in prostitution because I would be warned. So, however, the sad truth is that our state believes that sexual violence against women is normal because its liberal legislation on prostitution means nothing else. That is what people are guiding themselves with. That's how children grow up in our country, in Germany, believing that it isn't violence when women and young girls in prostitution are penetrated daily, sometimes 10, 20 times a day, and are deprived of their dignity and worth. But of course, it is violence. So exiting and escaping after the experiences you made in prostitution is very hard. A physical exit from prostitution, the bodily step into real life, can often be managed, but the physical exit does not automatically mean the psychological exit. So being in prostitution, you experience the deepest abysses of our society, an immeasurable and unimaginable extent of violence, humiliation, lies, and inhumanity. One can flee from this life physically, but psychologically hang in the thick of memories and pain, and often due to the experiences you have made, there is a deep belief that you are worthless, you are unable to achieve anything and deserve nothing else. So the physical exit is often difficult, but the psychological exit is even more difficult because it often takes years or even decades, and it involves breaking through pain and trauma. It is the slow distancing from an earlier life full of violence, and this psychological exit is difficult but extremely important, and it's not about forgetting your experiences, but it is about accepting the non-erasable past, to integrate it into your life and to simultaneously break free from this parallel world of prostitution and trafficking. So to come to the end, I want to mention the last point, and it's about also what we have talked about. It's about demand. To fight trafficking and exploitation, we need to reduce demand, because demand is a breeding ground for trafficking. Where there is a high demand, it's much more lucrative for traffickers. You cannot fight trafficking when you are promoting demand on the other side. And when you treat prostitution as a job, as a service that can be bought like you can buy a pack of cigarettes like it is in Germany, you are promoting demand. In Germany, we have an estimated number of 1.2 million sex buyers who use sexual services each day. So you can imagine that traffickers in Germany are becoming rich. So Germany is unfortunately a country where pimps and traffickers are able to become rich with a very low risk of being prosecuted. A very low risk because they can hide very well behind legal structures. So thousands of women in Germany are used and exploited, but nobody is really seeing this because it is hidden behind a legal system, behind a legislation that calls all the women in prostitution automatically prostitutes. But most of these, and we speak about 200,000 to 400,000 women in prostitution in Germany, they are no prostitutes. They are trafficked, they are forced, they were abused as a child and never got to know what it means to live a life without violence, to live a life with dignity, or they do not find the way out after their trafficking and exploitation situation, as it was also the case with me. So statistically, there is a high probability to become a whole life prostitute after being exploited and trafficked, not because you want it, but because you are broken. And most of these so-called prostitutes are the children who were left behind when they were young and now left behind a second time by society. So I don't like to call these broken souls prostitutes. They are no prostitutes from the heart. After my trafficking and exploitation situation, I become also such a free choice prostitute, but not because I was a prostitute from the heart. I became one because on the one hand, I don't know how to exit this life after my exploitation. So I was highly traumatized because of what has happened. And at the end, I lived in a brothel where I was exploited, had no flat, had broken up with school, had almost no contacts to people outside the red light. And on the other hand, I had experienced so much sexual abuse and exploitation that I lost my worth, my identity, my personality, that I thought I don't deserve help from people outside the red light, and that I have to do the exit on my own, no matter how long it takes. And when you start with nothing, and when you have the feeling that the only thing you are worth is what your trafficker has made out of you, a prostitute, it takes time. It takes time to find back to yourself. And honestly, a lot of women being trafficked and exploited never find back to themselves because they had been broken too much. So statistically, there's a high probability to become a whole life prostitute after being trafficked. So you have a free choice prostitute, but nobody is seeing the stories behind these free choice prostitutes. So it's not because you want it, but because you are broken. And in this situation, I even defended my prostitution outwardly because I don't want people to see how far I'm actually down, how far I'm on the edge, and because it would hurt too much to say that it is violence when you physically and or psychologically see no way to escape this violence. So I was never a prostitute from the heart. I grew up with the wish of becoming a sea biologist when I first saw the film Free Willy, when I was a child, and not of becoming someone being penetrated one day after the other. So in the meantime, my dreams changed because of my trafficking and prostitution experiences. So after my exploitation, I catched up school education, which I had broken up before because of my trafficker. I studied law, and I'm going to become a lawyer fighting against exploitation and for enlightenment. This is what I am from the heart. And other women dream, for example, of being a police officer, a scientist, an artist, and so on. They dream about a lot, but not of being a prostitute. So no matter what kind of prostitution legislation we prefer, and I prefer the so-called Swedish Nordic model and fighting for this to implement in Germany with a lot of other great people. Nobody can tell me that only one child on this earth grows up with the wish of becoming a prostitute, with the wish of being penetrated hundreds, thousands of times by strangers. Children do not grow up with this wish. So, of course, I cannot speak for every woman who is in prostitution, but for the majority. And we do not have 200,000 so-called prostitutes in Germany. Instead, what we do have in Germany for sure of thousands of broken children whose dreams were taken away from them and who are locked now in the system of prostitution. I was just one of these 200,000 to 400,000 who are just called prostitutes and where the stories behind are mostly unknown. So whoever is listening here, I please you do not normalize or accept such a system where you can find so many broken lives and souls, but instead fighting the system, and fighting the system means to fight against demand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. It's listening to this painful story is painful for us. It's a very strong testimony, and you made very much clear that there are thousands of broken children out and no so-called prostitutes. You have already a comment on what you said, a very powerful and moving testimonial of someone who went through the hell that is human trafficking. Thank you for sharing your story. There is a question with it. We come to the question at the end of the event. I see Sister Leah wants to say something. So now I give the word to Sister Leah for about 10 minutes. Sister Leah, you can comment on it, you can share your experience, and you can just enrich us with your wisdom. Thank you. Eve, can you unmute Sister Leah? Yes, go on.
I thank very much Sandra for her talk. It touches me very hard because I am together now with small kids. We have 40 kids in the house I help, and 3 of them, 12 years old, are pregnant. It's awful. And I see how these kids have no possibility to grow up light and learning all what's happening around. They are really used, and that is awful. I thank you, Sandra, that you speak, that you touches us, that it is very a criminal act, and that we reach that these criminals are very much in jail and everything, because they are criminals and they are not. They do so much harm to children and young women. It's just awful. And I cannot understand that in Germany we cannot forbid prostitution, because that is always, violence is never free. I believe I have spoken with a lot of women in prostitution. I never called prostitutes. I say always women in prostitution because they are not free in that. Even when they say, oh, I make that. I think all together what's happened, that the women accept is very an act of violence and criminality. We will do everything that it gets forbidden in Germany, like in the other countries, Sweden and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. We will explore this more. That what you spoke about is more. It's not really the Nordic model because there is prostitution is not forbidden in this sense. And I think Inge Bell is a real expert to explain the Nordic model. And I would like you to give your comments and your explanation to this law that exists already and is successful. You have the floor, Inge.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank you, Sandra. It's always when we are together on panels like this or conferences, though I know your story and I know you since a lot of years, it's always very touching, moving, and still I'm always happy that I'm not the speaker right after you, because I could simply not speak after hearing your story, which I already know. And maybe I just want to contribute to what Sister Leah said. Sister Leah, I'm not sure whether you know that you could have now taken the floor longer to present your wonderful organization Solvudi. So maybe before I talk about the Nordic model, maybe Sister Leah, who is such a famous woman and one of the, well, she is the pioneer of anti-human trafficking engagement and action, and maybe she should speak first about Solvudi. Yeah. Maybe
I will say something. I'm very happy to have the occasion to say. I was as a sister, missionary sister, in Kenya, Mombasa, a paradise, very nice. And then people came who had enough money to pay a traveling in this paradise. And they have seen the misery and the poverty of people there, women and children. And they used that for her own pleasure. So I was so angry about that. And I spoke with the women. I said, what do you think, and so on. And they said, do you think it's a pleasure for us to go with all these idiots? And then I said, if you feel like that, let's go together and think what can we do to bring you out of that. And really, a lot of young women met school, met profession, they are teacher and others. That was very, very important. And then I have seen the children, and my foundation was Solvudi, Solidarity with Women in Distress, because I feel that prostitution diminishes all women, if they're in prostitution or not. It says, in our country, it says, women you can buy. And things you can buy is an object, it's not a person. So I cannot understand that we are not ready to accept that it's forbidden. In Kenya, it's also, the women go in prison because traveling in purpose of prostitution is forbidden. And they take the women to fill up their purses, and they have to pay. If they have no money, they go in jail. Never the men. They say you are walking on the street only to get a man for prostitution. So that makes me very, very angry. And the women I have met together are the same. And then I have seen a lot of children who are not accepted in their family because the mother was too young to get a child, or was not accepted, was not married, was not so. And then these children of these misused women are also put aside, are on the street. And that's why we have now, I am looking now for these women, and Solvody I have given in other hands because I'm old. But one thing I will do is always being scared for children, young girls who are brought in prostitution, like Sandra. It's so awful, and it's such a big crime that the rest of my life, I will help these young children to get out of that, to get in school, to get healed, to get proud of their own person. I would like that every child can be proud of themselves. And that is why I will do everything to help young girls, children, and that's my new foundation, is Foundation for Children in Distress, in Misery. And I'm happy, and I see it's very important. I can do as long as I live for this, for children. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, for these words. Very touching and very with passion. And I think only with passion can bring something forward and stay connected and go on against all the obstacles that we meet in this fight. So thank you very much. Now, Inge, you can explain more about the Nordic model, please. Thank you.
I will do so. But first of all, thank you very much, Leah, for your kind words. And just to give you a short impression, well, I'm not a journalist anymore, but I used to work almost 15 years for First German Television for ARD as a journalist with the focus on the political, social, and economic development in Southeastern Europe. And it was the time after the Iron Curtain came down, and later on after the Kosovo War. And as you know, these countries in Southeastern Europe, in Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, were reform countries, post-socialist countries, with all these big problems which persist until today. So organized crime, prostitution, human trafficking. And as we all know, since the EU accession of Romania and Bulgaria, what we face now in Germany is that most of the women in prostitution are from these countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and when Sister Leah started her help program in Kenya back in the 80s, 85, I think you founded the first Solvody Solidarity with Women in Distress organization in Kenya. By that time, you focused on the sex tourism in these countries, but then you came back to Germany, and after 89, the wall came down, and you witnessed all this this influx of the Eastern European countries into Germany, into prostitution, all the Polish, the Czech, the Russian, and then later on the Romanian and Bulgarian women, and very young women and girls who flooded literally the prostitution scene. And so you started Solvody also in Germany. And I think we have right now almost 20 special advisory centers and shelters in Germany, and also in Hungary, in Romania, and of course the big organization which persists since 85 in Kenya, with what you said, Solvody, the follow-up organization for the girls victims of trafficking. And this is a life achievement, Schwester Lea, and thank you very much for this. And we came across, we met when I was still this reporter back in 1999 when the Kosovo War took place, and I was a reporter a war reporter in the Kosovo War, and I came across a topic which never left me until today. This is trafficking with children, with underage, with with children, for the purpose of sexual exploitation by soldiers, by United Nations soldiers, by KFOR, Kosovo Force peacekeeping troops. I mean, the bombings in Kosovo had just been over, like in 1999 and 2000, and international peacekeeping troops, thousands of United Nations soldiers, were all over the Balkans to stabilize the region and to defend human rights and peace. But instead of defending human rights, these soldiers would abuse them. These soldiers would buy sex services of underage girls, raped and forced to prostitute themselves. They were collected all over Eastern Europe and brought to Macedonia, to Kosovo, and to the surrounding countries in order to satisfy the needs of the soldiers. And of course, I was deeply shocked at that very moment. But what I did is I did not only report about it, but I also went like freeing women from these jails, because they were jailed into these brothels. They could not go out. There were iron bars in front of the windows. And what we did as journalists, we did not only report, but we wanted to help them, these women and underage girls. And that's why Schwester Lea and I met, because on the long run, I could free some women out of these brothels and bring them to Solvodi, back to Germany. And what I want to say is that, I'm not a journalist anymore, but when I was a journalist, it could have been absolutely sufficient and very honorable to just make this investigative documentary about this horrific human trafficking scandal, peacekeeping soldiers and underage forced prostitutes. Wow, this is sex and crime. What a story, what a scoop. Yeah? Lots of journalists would have dreamt of such an opportunity. But yes, of course, I did this investigative TV report, and it became a huge sensation, and it took everybody up, society, politicians, human rights organizations, and of course also the peacekeeping troops, the German soldiers. It was not only the German soldiers, it were Austrian soldiers, American soldiers from France, from England, from all over the world. Well. And today it is a known fact that peacekeeping soldiers are often involved in human trafficking or human rights abuse. And raising awareness as well as educating among the troops is standard now, or should be at least. Yeah? But sadly enough, these human rights abuses by United Nations soldiers still happen today. And I did not want just to report about it. I felt that I could act, because when I came across these children, I wanted to change the world of these children a little bit for the better. And I would also start raising awareness campaigns about the big business of human trafficking with my capabilities. Yeah? So I started then to establish several humanitarian aid programs for these girls. I was a journalist, and I had a lot of contacts and with people and organizations. And so I started humanitarian work. And some of the programs are still running until today. I wrote and write books on human rights violation. I deliver speeches as today. I hold seminars, and I teach on human rights at the university. And so now so it's now 20 years later, and I still fight against human trafficking and prostitution. And sometimes it seems to me that nothing changes. But then I see a lot of things changed, because when I started like 20 years ago, there was no Honeyball report. There was no EU parliamentary resolution like since 2014, when they said, well, prostitution is really harmful, and please stop, demand, do, and please. The recommendation is please introduce in the legislation in the European Union countries, introduce the Nordic model. The Nordic model, which is since 20 years in action in Sweden. then later on in Norway, in Iceland, in Ireland, in Canada, in France, and now recently in Israel. And as far as I know, Spain is also preparing laws in order to introduce the Nordic model. And now I come to the point. The Nordic model is about decriminalizing the prostitutes, but criminalizing the dons, so the buyers of this, I really hate to say the word, of these sex services, because it's not a service and it is not sex. It is rape, and it can never be a service because prostitution can never be a job. Yeah? So, but the basic thing is helping. Basic thing of Nordic model, as Sweden introduced it, is decriminalizing women and girls in prostitution, helping them out of prostitution, criminalizing the buyers, so stop the demand by criminalizing the buyers. It's also really sensitization, awareness raising in the society. And it's this awareness raising in society starts very early, already in school or in kindergarten, that is absolutely forbidden that one sex buys the other sex, that men buy women, that men can buy the access to the bodies of women and children, and this is a legal law for them. So this is absolutely a no-go, but this is still the case in Germany. Yeah. So first of all, decriminalize prostitutes or women in prostitution, criminalize the buyers, awareness raising for the society, real help for the women in prostitution, and no such helping cosmetics, as I always say. It has to be real help for them, real support, and starting at an early age. And the absolute conviction or the commitment to the sentence that prostitution is can never be on one step with gender equality. Prostitution is the contrary of gender equality, because prostitution is violence against women and girls. So, which was a very revolutionary act by then in Sweden, is now agreed by most of the Swedish population. If you go on to Sweden and you ask people in Sweden, what do you think about prostitution? Most of them would say, prostitution? No. This is not in accordance with gender equality. No. This is not in accordance with dignity, with human dignity. No, this can never be a job. Oh my God! And someone who buys the sexual services of a woman in prostitution, he's seen as like a drug addict or a loser. So he's seen very strange person. Yeah? This is 20 years later in Sweden. Yeah? And when we look at Germany, who chose 20 years ago the other way, the way to legalize prostitution, to have a liberal thought on this, to think, okay, we might get the women out of the stigma, of the stigmatization, when we introduce a more liberal law and we do like some regulatory things in our legislation. But now when you ask someone here in Germany on the street, what do you think about prostitution? Then you would have the answer, well, prostitution, oh, that's cool. Well, it's just sex work. And if they choose to do it voluntarily, that's just cool. So, which is really sad, because what happened in Germany is now that the whole world is looking upon Germany like we look into America, into the US legislation on arms, on weapons. Yeah, we really think, oh my God, weapons are legalized there, and one can have weapons and arms. So, and we think, oh my God, how is this possible? And the whole world looks on Germany and says, my God, how is this possible? They legalized prostitution and all the women are sexually exploited. And you literally see what happened with this Eastern Europe thing, that all the young Bulgarian and Romanian women and girls come over to Germany and flood the prostitution market there and are exploited. They are not workers. They're just exploited. They are victims of violence. And oh my God, what is Germany doing here? No? So we are looked upon like the brothel of Europe, in Germany, as the brothel of Europe, Germany should be a lighthouse. It should send out a signal against prostitution, against exploitation, and against violence against women in prostitution. But it is not yet. So, but what I can tell you, what is, I said before that I witnessed 20 years of, well, slow change, but I'm really very happy to tell you that about 1 month ago, in Germany was founded a bigger alliance, an alliance Nordic model in which unite now more than 30 organizations. Among them, of course, big organizations like Solvodi, like Sisters, which is represented by Sandra here in this panel, and also by Terre de Femmes, which is my organization where I'm the vice president. So it's not only the big organizations with shelters and women's rights, but it's also the grassroots initiatives. So, and also church, the Katholische Deutsche Frauenbund, the Catholic Alliance, German Women's Alliance, is also within this alliance for the Nordic model. So we have this broader alliance now with hundreds and thousands of members, which advocate for the Nordic model. And it has to have a joint approach towards the politicians in order to change this absurd legislation, and a legislation which is simply laughed at, for example, by the countries of the Nordic model. Yeah, well, it's not laughed at, but it's seen with a tear in the eyes because it's so anti-humanistic. Yeah, it's so anti-humanistic. So with one word, we have failed in Germany with our legislation of liberalizing and regulating prostitution. And we made hundreds of thousands of girls and women victims of violence by this legislation. And it's high time now to change the view, to change the perspective on prostitution as to that what it is. It's pure and simply violence against women. And we cannot support a system which is doing harm to thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s women and children in prostitution. We must change the system, helping the victims, criminalizing the Johns who create this demand, yeah, and really awareness raising among the population. And as the end of my talk, I would like to give, indeed, as cynical as it may sound, but I want to give the voice to 3 Johns. I'm quoting now from the Ellie Arrow. Ellie Arrow is one of the human rights activists, which is also in the Alliance for the Nordic Model. She collects quotes from Johns, and I would really like to give a quotation to one of the Johns. So let me see where it is. One moment. Here it is. I booked this animal once. So what I quote is from an internet forum, because in Germany you can easily access brothels or women in prostitution by the internet. There are lots of forums where the Johns can write about their experiences or about the women and girls. So I booked this animal once. Her apartment stinks of cat piss. Also, the bed was broken. And the so-called execution mattress is so fluffy that you can catch all kinds of things. She wasn't shaven, even though I demanded that. Further, she kept trying to get me to pay extra and had to keep consulting her boyfriend or her pimp. So one German sex buyer or John who wrote in one forum. I have another one. You got young women from Hungary, sometimes so thinly clothed that it amounts to Christian charity to take them inside and warm them up with your body for half an hour or so. The beds are a catastrophe. You can see a trace of the previous guy's sperm. You can imagine that you're just picking up a young girl, which is neat. And the third voice. Is a whore just a piece of is a whore just a piece of fuck meat, or does one have to show respect? I've been wondering if my approach is the rule. To me, a whore is just a thing that's there to satisfy me. I do my part by paying. Now, I've noticed that especially hobby whores have been getting more bitchy and annoying while asking for more and more cash. Have any of you noticed the same? So with this quote, you can easily see that when there is a purchasing act of so-called sex services, then there is no eye level with a human being, with a woman or with a girl. It is just a thing. It's just an object. So therefore, prostitution can never be a job when there is no human being doing this job, but a thing, a robot, an object. Yeah. So I want to close my talk with this. Germany, and not only Germany, the whole European Union has to introduce the Nordic model, because all the models until today, abolition models, so criminalizing prostitutes and liberalizing or regulating the prostitution, have failed. So the Nordic model is the only leftover chance to get gender equality and human rights for women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Inge. What can I say? The whole cruelty of what's going on was just described, not by you, but by the sex buyers themselves, you know. So that speaks for itself. That is, thank you very much for this comprehensive insights. Now first I have to say we have a lot of support for Sandra, and many people thank her for her powerful message. So I will go and read more. There are also questions now. For example, I once read that sexual services are the oldest profession in the world. Would you agree with this statement? And if this is the case, what is the prognosis of addressing demand? How difficult is it to address demand if it was supposedly always there? So could you just comment on this? Who would like to start?
I mean, prostitution, the oldest profession in the world, is one of the most ridiculous statements ever. And it's obviously made up by a man to justify the creation and the continuation of the institution. It's just patriarchy, right? That's a statement that comes straight from the mouth of patriarchy. Just because something is doesn't mean it always needs to be that way. And the solution, of course, is it comes from the mouth of patriarchy, dismantle patriarchy, right? Wherever we see change coming, positive change in this respect. So I'm talking about Sweden, Norway, now Ireland, and a few others. Wherever you see the Nordic model being introduced, the equality model now it's being called, there is often this, I use it as a kind of a proxy indicator, the number of women in parliament as a proxy indicator. So you can look at the number of women in parliament in the countries where it's been introduced. There is a certain reduction of patriarchy in the countries where the Nordic model is introduced. And they're almost like there's a tipping point. I think Germany's like 31%, Sweden's 47% women in parliament, Norway's 41%, maybe 40 is the number, I don't know. But there seems to be a number where you can start to achieve change, dismantling patriarchy, when the men in that society start to believe in the equalities that are needed and start to believe that prostitution is violence against women. So there needs to be this, there seems to be this tipping point. I don't know whether anybody else has observed such a proxy indicator for it, but.
Thank you. Somebody else? Otherwise, I have another very interesting question. A question about the language you are using. And maybe that is one of the things the public needs to be more educated about. I was recently told by a person running an advice center for women working in prostitution in my city to please avoid the word prostitution as it is the meaning. Instead, she advised me to use the words like sexual or sex workers. Now, I hear a very difficult language here. In your view, what would be an appropriate language to use to talk about this? What would be a language that would help to raise awareness? Thank you for this question. Who would like to explain or to answer? Sandra, yeah.
Is the micro on? Yes. Okay. So that is what one point where I was also talking not a lot, but a little bit in my talk, that we in Germany have also a lot of counseling stations using the term sex workers, and it's a job like any other. And the problem with this language is that, so I'm just speaking now from Germany, because I don't know about the country where this question came from. But in Germany, we have a very strong pro-prostitution lobby who, spread the word that we have to use the word sex worker because prostitution is stigmatizing, and for all the women I'm working with, it's completely different, because if you use the word sex work, then you are telling this woman who was abused and who experienced a lot of violence in prostitution that this was just work, and for them it's not stigmatized to be called prostituted women, but for them it is stigmatizing to be called sex workers, because this hides the violence and the abuse they have gone through in their lives, and it's making violence invisible. Because when you call something work, you hide the violence behind this and the actual problem of prostitution. So all the women I know who have experienced a lot of violence in prostitution, they hate the word sex workers because they don't feel taken seriously, and they don't understand, that people who use the word sex work, they, for me and the women I am talking about, they do not really understand the system of prostitution, because as we talked all in our speeches the last 1 hour, when you call a system work where so many people are suffering and experience so much violence, you cannot call this work. So it's stigmatizing to call them sex workers. So I really hate the word sex workers, and if somebody calls me sex worker, then I really feel bad and I really feel stigmatized, because this is not what I have experienced. I have experienced trafficking, forced prostitution and prostitution, but I experienced never, kind of work. This was not work, because as Inge said, it's neither sex nor work, what you experience there. Yeah.
Maybe I can add to this as well. So just a short, and then you, Brian. What my best practice is, meanwhile, I try not to speak about prostitutes, but about women and girls in prostitution, because they're human beings, women and girls in prostitution, and prostitution is the system. So they're not prostitutes, they're not characterized by the system. They happen to be in that form of sexual exploitation, which is called prostitution. So women and girls in prostitution. And then there's this other aspect, sex work. I would never use this as well. Neither sex nor work. what I always find very interesting is, for example, one other woman who was a survivor of prostitution. She always says, when sex should be something very joyful and lustful, and for this mutual satisfaction of the people, and as soon as there's no consent, so when there's consent, then it is sex, okay? But when there's no consent, or when the consent has to be paid, then it turns into no consent, but just a paid consent. But paid consent is no consent to sex. It's the consent to the money. It's the yes to the money. It's not the yes to the sex. And a no to the sex is a rape. So it cannot be sex work. It's rape. And then the third thing, which I always say when it comes to these terminologies, is, okay, we in Germany, we have 3 words for example, Sexarbeit, Sklavenarbeit, Zwangsarbeit. So forced labor, slavery labor, and sex work. But it is not work. I mean, you would never say to slavery that it's slavery work. Yeah, it's slavery. You would never say to forced labor in the Nazi regime, for example. You would never say it's work. Yeah, it was slavery. It was forced. So this is the same: prostitution, sex slavery, slavery, and forced labor. Yeah, Brian, the floor is yours.
I mean, you've said everything. What I just wanted to say was that I quite often get attacked as a guy having an opinion on this, which is crazy because, you know, we created prostitution, right? But we should be the ones to help dismantle it, and the fact that we're not is really outrageous. But I quite often get attacked, and one of the things I get attacked about is if I talk about women in prostitution or women used in prostitution, for example. I often get attacked and said that's so dismissive of sex workers, right? And this happens in particular with audiences in the US, UK, and Australia. I mean, if you had to narrow down the numbers, these are the countries where it's really problematic. And to be fair, I think it's actually quite a strategy from this. Sandra mentioned the pro-prostitution lobby. It's actually a strategy by this school of liberal feminism, which believes in the full decriminalization, right? And so they think, or that they propose that they're empowering women by calling them sex workers and want it to be called a job, want it to be taxed, etc. And yet all the evidence suggests that that's absolutely a dreadful system, and it diminishes women so dreadfully and minimizes, trivializes the violence against women. And as even, I think you'll understand, most of you will be familiar with Kathleen Barry. So, you know, if you read what she was writing in the 70s, it was a bit liberal feminist, right? It was a bit full decriminalizations, you know, didn't go as far as saying sex workers, I don't think, but, and you know, within about 10 years, she had changed her tune dramatically, you know, allowing the full decriminalization institutionalizes and industrializes the abuse of women. And so you can't have both. You can't have a system that says, on the one hand, women can be objectified and used and sold, and on the other side, have women treated well. You will only see the industrialization of the prostitution of women if you go down that decriminalization path. It just makes absolutely no sense to do it. But this liberal feminist school is very strongly using this term sex work and sex worker to marginalize men, actually, and get men out of the debate. And if men leave the debate, I think we're in trouble, right? I mean, if the men in Sweden weren't part of the debate, we wouldn't have the Nordic model, I don't think. 41% of women in parliament, or 47% of women in parliament now. But if the average Swedish man was not seeing it as violence against women, I think we'd be in trouble with the Nordic model. It wouldn't be implemented as well as it has been.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to have a guy with us, and even you are a soldier, a former soldier. So everything what Inge said before, you prove it has to be like this way. There are others out there as well, and that's good to know. Leah, you wanted to say, yeah. We need you to be unmuted. Wait, Leah. No.
Speaking.
Oh.
No. Is that? Yes. when I was in Peking in the conference, in the women's conference in Peking, there was a whole procession of comfort women from Japan, because during the war, the government has selected women to be, for the soldier, a comfort. I think it's such a Abwertung, it's a diminution and not respecting women in the society, to say they are just good for comforting the soldier. I think it's a whole thinking in the community that is influenced by acts like that. And these women were under the conference in Peking, and there were a whole procession, and they said, we are the comfort women. That means we are only there to serve men. And a society where only the men are the misters and the women are to serve them, that is not a society we wish in our countries. And that is always not respect for the women, for all women, not only for them who are misused, for all women.
I'm already looking at the time, but I have one question here, and maybe everybody of you could say one short opinion on this. And this is the real golden question. Of course, reduce the number of buying, but how? You know, so we hear a lot about it, and men agencies are talking about demand. But I still have to get the golden formula of how to tackle demand. What would you say, Inge? Yeah.
Me first? Okay. Well, as Albert Schweitzer once said, even the little what you can do help. Even the small steps help. I only know the German saying it's, das wenige, was du tun kannst, ist viel. Even the small steps help. So what you can do is very practical. First of all, you can write to your politicians. I mean, hopefully you're living in a democracy. So go and talk to your politicians and say, no, we don't want this to happen in our country, because prostitution is not gender equality, will always hamper gender equality, will always contradict gender equality, and is always violence against women and girls. So go and talk to your politicians. I mean, go and look for where you can unite and where you can approach, not as an individual, but as a group to raise your voice. Go and speak to the media. Support the NGOs who are doing all this grassroots work, like, for example, Solvodi, the organizations which do provide shelters, and support the local organizations you certainly have in each and every country, like where Sandra is putting her effort and her power into, like Sisters. So survivors of prostitution, survivors of human trafficking, they need help. I mean, they need, as Sandra pointed it out, I mean, you go out of the prostitution system, of the exploitation physically, but you still are heavily burdened with psychological issues. So these people need help, and raise awareness about the topic in your families, within your friends and acquaintances. So speak about the topic, yeah, and in order that it comes out of this oh la la taboo zone, yeah, prostitution, oh my God, voluntarily work. So there's a lot you can do, yeah, raising awareness in your field, in your friends, families, and so on. Politicians, shelters, organizations, whole bunch of things.
Lea, you are the next, please.
I would say sometimes in the earlier years, also a very big newspaper made reclame for Sonne, son and sex. And there were meetings in the news like that. So that was my first protest against that. And everywhere I shout that and said, that is not allowed. You would not write to them and so on. I think it's small things we have to be very careful not to allow. Also the small talks or jokes about that, not accept that. I don't know, but everywhere we are not in all the different places, but in the places we are, it must be clear that we are against this behavior against women. And prostitution must be seen as Verbrechen, as criminal act. And of course, when I have an organization who fight against, I would like that you help me to help. Now I said it's the children, but it's very, very important that the children are not misused. Children on the street. And I always think, each government must see that the children who live on the street, who survive because they are grabbing and stealing, when they are big, grown-ups, they will be not good in the society to bring them up. So every government has interest to give the children a chance, that the society has also the chance. If we are egoists, that is the argument that must be seen for everyone. I will like to live in a society where it's not the criminals who have the power.
Thank you, Lea. I go for via screen, and the next is Sandra.
I am the next.
Yes.
So I think the question was how to tackle demand. You know, I think in Germany it's the problem that we have this liberal prostitution law, which is promoting demand because it says that prostitution is a job like any other. And of course, when you say it's a job, then you have a high demand. So our community, our society is also socialized in the point of view that demand is nothing bad, but demand is something normal. Like as I said before, you can buy a pack of cigarettes, or you can buy a human being, you know. And so to tackle demand, it first needs the consciousness of the people that this is wrong, you know, what they do, that they are destroying lives, that most of the women are not there by free choice, and when they are there by free choice, they have experienced abuse before. So that is not, you know, sex work, but this is the prostitution system is a whole circle of violence and abuse. And you have to enlighten society about that, and also implementing the Nordic model, which tackles demand. So where buying sexual services is a crime, you know, because in Germany, I see also no other way to reduce demand, to tackle demand, because, you know, if you can buy a, you know, if it's allowed, you know, to buy a pack of cigarettes, you will buy this pack of cigarettes, you know, and men will not stop buying the bodies of women as long as it is not forbidden, you know. And so the very first step is to to not allow, buying sex. And then also to educate, in Sweden, they have programs, also in France, that if police is catching, a sex buyer, he has to go to a program where he is told what he does wrong, what is the consequence of what he did, what's the story of a person who is in prostitution, she is maybe trafficked. So it needs also education then on the buyer side. Yes.
Thank you, Sandra. Now, Brian, how to tackle demand?
Raise our children to know that consent to access their bodies can never be bought. There's lots of other things we can do, of course. The Nordic model is why we're here. So imprisonment, criminal records, sex offender lists, education, public information. On the law enforcement side, breaking communication between buyers and sellers, increasing the distance, reducing the convenience of it. More women in parliament, as I said before. There seems to be this tipping point. Tell men it's not okay. Because as soon as you legalize something, you tell them that it's okay. I just want to close on one point. There's my favorite saying from the Roman poet Virgil was that from a single crime, know a nation. I think that there's actually no better test of the quality of a nation, of a society, than how they address the trafficking of women for prostitution. It is a litmus.
Thank you very much. So as we are already a little bit over time, I would close this round and give back to Michel.
Yeah. Tu me donnes le micro? Oh, okay. Yes. At the end of this first webinar, allow me to thank not only Sister Mirjam, but also all speakers and organizers, and including our webmaster, Yves Reichenbach, and my assistant, Clara Isepi. My gratitude to all speakers for their clear, powerful statements and even moving testimonies. We shall use your strong arguments to advocate for the adoption and implementation of the Nordic model in Germany and in Europe. We shall meet again next Tuesday, the 20th of April, at the same time to continue the discussion and see the importance of supply chain control and the role of consumers in relation to forced labor. And the last of these 3 webinars on the 27th of April shall deal with the role of technology in human trafficking. In the meantime, I do encourage you to visit the christusliberat.org website, where you will find a treasure chest of best practices and access to a free online course on human trafficking for helpers and the opportunity to register to all future webinars. Goodbye now. I wish you a good week and thank you to all for being with us tonight. And I was very happy to see again Sister Leah and to know Ingebel and to know Sandra Norak, and of course our good friend Brian Iselin is always a gem of a speaker and a very powerful speaker for all those. And we shall listen to him, listen to Sister Mirjam again, and again have a good night. And thanks to everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Michel. Take care. Nice to meet you all.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. C'est bien?
Ich weiß nicht, wie ich hier rausgehe.